The storm should have taken her life. Everyone agreed on that. A federal prosecutor, Grace Monroe, was found inside a mangled SUV clinging to a cliff above the roaring Pacific. No footprints, no witnesses, and somehow she survived long enough for a stranger to pull her from the edge of death. What no one knew, what Grace herself didn't remember, was that her rescuer wasn't a first responder or a passing driver. It was a man the law had already labeled a criminal, a former Navy SEAL named Ethan Cole, and his battle-scarred German Shepherd, Ranger. That night chained all three of them to a secret bigger than the storm itself. Because Grace wasn't just in an accident. Someone forced her off that road. Someone who knew she was investigating a corruption ring buried deep in Alaska's shipping routes, one that had already framed Ethan for a crime he never committed. And now, as winter melts into spring, the truth they uncovered will bind them together, or destroy everything they've begun to heal. If you want to follow this journey to the very end, tap follow and comment where you're listening from. Or simply type "Amen" to send strength to everyone who needs this story today. The wind on Kodiak Island carried a kind of cold that didn't just sting the skin. It climbed inside a man and stayed there. It wrapped itself around the ribs, settled behind the lungs, and reminded him why he had come to this remote corner of Alaska in the first place. Ethan Cole stepped out of his weather-beaten cabin and pulled his hood tighter, the frigid air cutting through even the thick canvas of his parka. He was a tall man, 6'1", with broad shoulders shaped by years of military conditioning. His face was angular, defined by a square jaw dusted with a few days of dark stubble, and thin lines around his eyes that were once sharp steel blue but now carried a muted weight, as if every memory dimmed their shine a little more. Beside him trotted Ranger, his German Shepherd, a large male with a striking saddle pattern and a faint gray wash along his back that made him look older than his 7 years. The dog was powerful but moved with a disciplined grace, a habit drilled into him back when he was a SEAL K9. The left ear perked sharply at every sound. The right, partially folded, no longer heard a thing after a close-range blast in Helmand Province. Ranger compensated with keen vibration sensitivity. He felt things before others noticed them. Sometimes Ethan wondered if Ranger sensed his nightmares before Ethan did. They walked the short trail to Ethan's old Chevy truck, parked crooked between two fir trees. Ranger hopped into the passenger seat, circling once before settling down, keeping his amber eyes on Ethan's face as if monitoring his emotional vital signs. Ethan reached over and scratched behind the dog's good ear. "We're good, buddy," he murmured quietly, his voice gravelly from sleep and silence. "Just another day." But Ranger didn't blink. He never did when Ethan lied. Ethan reversed out of the clearing, the tires crunching over crusted snow, and made the 15-minute drive to Hartman Logistics, the only freight company in this part of the island. The building resembled a neglected metal barn, gray siding, rust creeping along the corners, and a sagging sign missing the letter G. Steam poured out of the vents, mixing with the diesel fumes that always hung low in the yard. Inside the warehouse, heat radiated unevenly from overhead lamps, giving everything a faint orange tint. Mechanic bays lined the far wall, each lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. It wasn't glamorous work, but Ethan liked the routine. Machines didn't lie. Bolts, gears, hydraulic joints, they broke or they didn't. And if they broke, you fixed them. Humans were the complicated part. That truth walked toward him now in the form of Dylan Hartman, the shop manager. He was a stocky man in his mid-40s with thinning blonde hair slicked back too carefully, a round face flushed from drinking or yelling, often both, and eyes that moved like a man searching for where he last hid the truth. His clothes never matched. An expensive jacket over cheap slacks, polished shoes stepping in frozen mud. Dylan liked to pretend he ran an empire, when in reality, he barely ran a yard of 20 employees. "Cole," Dylan said, voice sharp and nasal. "You're late." Ethan checked his watch. "It's 6:59. "Shift starts at 7, Dylan snapped. "Which is in 1 minute, Ethan replied. Dylan's jaw flexed, but he forced a smile, thin and artificial. "We'll talk about punctuality during your review." Ethan let the comment die. Men like Dylan fed on reactions. The first job of the day was a military surplus loader purchased by the company. The machine needed stabilization arms replaced before it could be moved. Ethan forced himself into the rhythm he trusted. Evaluate, measure, disassemble, repair. Ranger lay on a mat a few feet away, eyes scanning the workers, tail still, body relaxed but ready. Most guys in the shop liked Ranger. They respected a working dog, even if they didn't fully understand one. But Dylan hated him. "Get that mutt out of my shop," Dylan snapped from across the room. "He's not in the way," Ethan replied without looking up. "And he's a certified service dog." "Yeah? Certify him to sit still. Makes the clients nervous." "We don't have clients here," Ethan muttered. "Just trucks." Dylan walked closer. "One day, that dog's going to cost me money." Ethan paused, lifted his eyes and stared straight through him. A seal didn't need volume to make a point. Dylan swallowed and stepped back, muttering something under his breath before walking away. Later that afternoon, tension simmered again when Ethan discovered a crate of parts with inconsistencies. The serial numbers were off. The weight was too low, and one line item described a specialized military microprocessor that shouldn't have been there. Ethan brought the manifest to Dylan, who waved him off with an annoyed flick of his hand. "Just sign the damn paperwork," Dylan said, shoving a clipboard at him. "I don't have time for your paranoia." "This inventory is wrong," Ethan replied. "And that microprocessor isn't even here." "It's not your job to worry about orders," Dylan retorted. "Sign it and move on." Ethan didn't sign. That night, 2 sheriff cruisers rolled up to his cabin. Ethan opened the door before they knocked, Ranger beside him, silent and alert. The lead deputy, Tom Willis, a broad man with tired eyes and a gentle face, explained that Ethan was being detained for suspicions of misappropriating equipment. Ethan didn't resist. Ranger whimpered softly as the handcuffs clicked around Ethan's wrists. At the station, Ethan learned the rest. The microprocessor he flagged earlier was suddenly reported missing, and the manifest, with Ethan's forged signature, became evidence. He spent the night in a cold holding cell, staring at the concrete floor, while Ranger waited, anxiously, with Mrs. Kincaid, an elderly neighbor with silver hair and a warm heart, who agreed to watch him. By morning, Ethan was released on strict conditions. 8 p.m. curfew, mandatory landline call-ins, restricted travel. The judge made it clear, any violation meant jail time. Back at the cabin, Ethan sat on his porch with Ranger pressed against his leg. Snowflakes drifted sideways in the wind, the sky already shifting toward early dusk. His cabin, his refuge, no longer felt safe. Ranger rested his head on Ethan's knee and let out a slow, weighted sigh. Ethan whispered, "They took everything else from me, buddy. They're not taking you." Ranger nudged his hand, as if promising he would never leave. In the stillness of the Alaskan wilderness, surrounded by cold and silence, Ethan understood one thing. He was being cornered. And the only life that mattered, the only one he could not lose, was lying right beside him, trusting him completely. It was that trust, that bond, that would set everything in motion. The Pacific storm arrived earlier than predicted, rolling in from the open water like a living creature, fast, cold, and merciless. By noon, the sky over Kodiak Island had turned the color of slate, and the wind pressed against Ethan Cole's cabin with a low, growling force that rattled the windows. He had hoped the forecast would be wrong, but nothing in Alaska ever softened for anyone, especially not for a man already cornered by fate. Ethan pulled on his insulated jacket. The thick navy blue one faded at the seams, and stepped outside with Ranger close behind. The German shepherd's heavy winter coat bristled as flakes of wet snow clung to his fur. Ranger was tense today, his paws pressed into the ground with deliberate caution, nose twitching at every shift of the wind. The dog didn't like storms. Loud thunder unsettled his injured ear, and the rapid pressure changes in the air reminded him of helicopter descents and explosions from a past neither he nor Ethan could fully leave behind. Ethan had taken an extra job that morning, a last-minute request from Harvey Jensen, the owner of a small fishing lodge 10 miles north of town. Harvey, a wiry man in his late 60s with a bushy gray beard and a deep-set pair of kind blue eyes, managed the lodge alone after his wife passed away. He walked with a slight stoop, the result of decades spent hauling nets and bending over boat engines. Though grief had carved permanent hollows beneath his eyes, Harvey remained patient, humble, and always quick with an apologetic smile. When he called Ethan asking if he could deliver a load of split firewood before the storm hit, "I've got out-of-state guests coming tomorrow, son, and they'll freeze if that furnace doesn't stay fed." Ethan couldn't refuse. Harvey was one of the few people in town who treated him with steady respect, never prying about the military past or the silent dog always by his side. The job paid enough to cover part of his legal fees, maybe even the initial consultation with a private investigator to prove Dylan Hartman was framing him. But more urgently, it gave Ethan something he needed. A chance to feel useful in a world that treated him like a ticking clock waiting to violate parole. He checked his watch. 3:42 p.m. Curfew check-in, 8 o'clock p.m. Sharp. In good weather, the round trip to Harvey's lodge and back took about 4 hours. In this storm, Ethan was gambling with minutes he didn't have. By 4:15, the truck bed was loaded, and Ethan drove north along the coastal highway. A narrow, twisting road cut between jagged cliffs on one side and the roaring ocean on the other. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, muscles coiled beneath his thick fur, golden eyes fixed on the snow blowing sideways across the windshield. Ethan kept one hand on the wheel and the other wrapped around the gear shift, knuckles pale as the storm intensified. Wind hammered the truck. Snow spiraled in chaotic sheets, dissolving the road into a white blur. The heater fought a losing battle against the cold, settling into the cab. "Easy," Ethan murmured as Ranger let out a low growl. Not at him, but at the road ahead. The dog leaned forward, ears tense, nose pressed to the glass. His body language changed, shifting from restlessness to a laser-focused alert Ethan recognized from their deployment days. Something was wrong. "What do you see, boy?" Ethan followed Ranger's line of sight, but visibility was deteriorating fast, whiteout conditions creeping toward them. The truck crept around a bend carved into the cliffside. Ranger suddenly emitted a sharp, urgent bark, then another, deeper and more frantic. Ethan's pulse spiked. Ranger only barked like that for danger. Real danger. Ethan hit the brakes. The truck skidded on a sheet of ice before coming to a controlled stop. The world outside was a screaming blur of white wind and shadows. Ranger pawed at the passenger door, whining, shaking, insistent. Ethan opened the door, and the dog bounded out, circling once before running toward the cliff's guardrail. Ethan followed, boots crunching into the accumulating snow, wind tearing at his clothes. Then he saw it. Below the cliff, angled grotesquely on a narrow ledge of rock, was a dark SUV. Its front end hung over nothing but open air and the violent crash of the Pacific 60 feet below. The headlights flickered weakly through broken glass. One wrong shift in weight, one gust of wind, and the car would tumble into the ocean. And someone was inside. Ethan's gut tightened. He slid down to his knees at the edge, gripping the icy guardrail with both hands. Through the cracked windshield, he could make out a figure slumped against the steering wheel. A woman with shoulder-length chestnut hair, partially matted with blood. Her skin, even from this distance, looked unnervingly pale. She wasn't moving. "Damn it!" Ethan breathed, searching for any sign of life. Ranger barked once, sharply. Ethan understood. The dog smelled a living person. He checked his watch again. 5:22 p.m., 2.5 hours from curfew. Even if he rescued her, even if everything went perfectly, he could never make it back in time. He would violate parole. He would be arrested. And Ranger, his Ranger, would be taken from him, labeled an unstable military K-9, likely destroyed. His chest constricted. Every survival instinct told him to walk away, drive home, protect the only family he had left. But then he saw the woman's fingers twitch, barely, but enough. She wasn't dead, not yet. He whispered into the storm, "No one gets left behind." Ethan stood, hands shaking, and pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen glowed through flakes of melting snow. One button pressed would signal he'd attempted to check in early. Maybe they'd forgive the rest. Maybe a storm outage would buy him time. Maybe. The phone buzzed. A notification. Signal weak. Searching. It wouldn't hold. He looked down at the SUV. Then, slowly, deliberately, he powered the phone off. Ranger watched him with solemn understanding, head tilted, breath fogging in the icy air. "Come on," Ethan said hoarsely. "We're going." He grabbed the tow chain from the truck bed, wrapped it over his shoulder, and climbed over the guardrail. The wind clawed at him, fighting each movement. Ranger stayed at the top, standing guard, pacing anxiously. Ethan descended the slope carefully, boots slipping on shattered rock and frozen mud. With each step downward, the roar of the ocean grew louder, hungry, violent. The SUV groaned, shifting a dangerous inch as Ethan reached the ledge. The woman inside stirred weakly, eyelids fluttering. He pressed his palm to the shattered driver's side window. "Ma'am, stay still," he called out, voice steady but urgent. "I'm going to get you out." A gust of wind slammed into the cliffside, shaking the SUV violently, and Ethan felt the rock beneath him tremble. The vehicle was seconds away from falling. He had made his choice, and now the storm would decide if he survived it. The chapter ends here, suspended on the edge of catastrophe. The SUV groaned under its own weight, the metal frame bending like a living creature in pain. Ethan Cole braced one hand on the shattered window, the other gripping the icy rock beneath him as wind clawed at his back. Inside the vehicle, the woman stirred again, weakly, barely, but it was enough to remind him she was still alive. Her face was partially illuminated by the flickering dashboard lights. Smooth, pale skin dusted with broken glass, a cut along her eyebrow leaking a thin trail of crimson. Chestnut hair hung in tangled strands across her cheek, wet from snow and blood. She looked like she had been thrown from one world and slammed violently into another. "Stay with me," Ethan said through the howl of the storm. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man who had pulled dying friends out of worse places. He drew back his elbow and smashed the side window with a single powerful strike. Glass exploded outward, carried immediately into the ocean wind. Ranger barked sharply from the top of the cliff, pacing in agitation, sensing the danger hanging over all of them. Ethan reached inside, ignoring the shards cutting into his forearm, and carefully pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck. A pulse. Weak, thready but present. He exhaled, relief flickering across his hardened features. "I'm going to get you out of here," he told her. Her eyelids fluttered open for a second. Her eyes, hazel with flecks of green, were disoriented but intelligent, like someone whose mind never stopped calculating, even when her body failed. Her lips parted as if to speak, but only a faint exhale escaped. Then she slumped again. Ethan wasted no time. He hauled himself onto the narrow ledge, anchored the tow chain to a metal hinge inside the car frame, and secured the other end to a thick, protruding rock. The SUV shifted dangerously, the ledge crumbling beneath one wheel. He reached through the broken window, undid her seatbelt, and pulled her gently toward him. The moment her weight shifted, the vehicle tilted forward with a violent groan. No time. He hooked his arms beneath hers and dragged her out through the window, bracing his boots against the rock face. Every muscle burned as he climbed back toward the slope, dragging her limp body with him. Twice he slipped. Once he nearly lost his grip. Ranger barked wildly, the sound sharp enough to cut through the storm. Ethan pushed harder, lungs burning, fingers numb, vision blurred by wind-driven snow. At last he reached the guardrail. Ranger immediately pressed against him, tail stiff, body trembling with protective urgency. Ethan lifted the woman into his arms and carried her toward the truck. She was light, lighter than he expected for someone around her mid-30s. But that lightness felt wrong, like she had been running on empty long before the accident. He opened the passenger door and laid her across the seat. Ranger jumped in beside her, then curled his body against her torso, applying slow, steady weight with trained precision. The woman's breathing evened out slightly. Ranger's therapy training, deep pressure stabilization, was doing its work. "That's it, buddy," Ethan murmured. "Keep her warm." He turned the heater to full blast, drove one-handed, and checked her periodically. A badge fell from her coat pocket during one of her shallow gasps. Ethan picked it up, eyebrows tightening. Grace Monroe, Assistant U.S. Attorney, a federal prosecutor. He stared at her again, this time noticing details he had missed in the chaos. The tailored charcoal coat, the modest gold necklace, the simple pearl earrings. Professional, understated, polished. Her expression, even unconscious, held a seriousness born from years of making impossible decisions. This was not a tourist who took a wrong turn. She was someone used to danger, but not the physical kind. Someone whose battles were waged in courtrooms, not war zones. And then Ethan saw something else. A second badge tucked inside her coat. Not a federal one, but local, issued by the Alaska State Investigations Bureau. She was working with state officers. On what? The answer arrived with a memory. a file Ethan once glimpsed in Dylan Hartman's office, the one with sealed federal markings. Ethan's gut twisted. "What were you digging into, Grace?" he whispered. 10 minutes later, Grace suddenly gasped awake. She flinched at Ranger's weight, but the dog remained calm, trained to hold steady under panic. "You're safe," Ethan said carefully. "You were in an accident." Grace tried to sit up. A bolt of pain forced her back down. She studied Ethan through half-lidded eyes, her voice hoarse. Who are you?" "Ethan Cole." Her gaze sharpened slightly. "The mechanic. From Hartman Logistics?" Even dazed, she recognized him. That wasn't comforting. It meant she had been looking into something connected to the company. "Why were you on that road?" Ethan asked. Grace swallowed hard. "Because your boss isn't who he says he is." Before Ethan could push for more, she winced and pressed a hand to her ribs. He saw the edges of deep bruising forming beneath her clothes. "We're taking you to the hospital," he said. "No," she whispered urgently. "There are people looking for me." Ethan frowned. "To help you?" She shook her head weakly. "No, to finish what they started." Before Ethan could question her further, headlights appeared suddenly behind them. Bright, blinding, far too close. A large truck pulled into view, tires skidding across the icy road, approaching faster than any sane driver would in this storm. Ranger growled, a deep rumble vibrating through the cab. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel. "Who would be following you in a blizzard?" Grace's eyes widened. "Not following, hunting." The truck swerved, accelerating toward Ethan's vehicle. He slammed the gas, but the pursuer closed in with terrifying speed. The chapter ends here, in the instant before impact, when the storm, the secrets, and the danger collide at once. The courthouse in Anchorage sat like a granite fortress against the late winter sky, gray, imposing, and cold in a way that seeped into a man's bones. Ethan Cole stood in the hallway outside courtroom 3B, wrists stiff from the too tight cuffs, shoulders squared with a calm he didn't truly feel. He wore the same clothes from the night of the storm, washed and dried but still carrying faint creases of urgency. Ranger sat at his side, tethered by a short lead the deputies insisted on, though the dog's posture remained alert and impeccably controlled. Ethan's jaw was unshaven, a few days of tension etched into his face. He looked like a man who had not slept, not eaten, and not trusted a single thing around him since the night he saved Grace Monroe and fled before the authorities could question him. He told himself he did it for Ranger, for survival. But he knew there was something else. A soldier's instinct to avoid being pinned down until he understood the battlefield. The bailiff opened the doors. "Cole, you're up." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with restrained attention. Wooden benches filled with townspeople, law clerks, and a handful of reporters, drawn by the sudden collapse of a federal prosecutor's car off a cliff and the mysterious appearance of a fugitive mechanic with a military background. Behind the prosecution table sat Dylan Hartman, wearing a crisp navy suit he had probably never worn before. His blonde hair was slicked back, but beneath the polished exterior his eyes darted nervously. Dylan's round cheeks flushed red each time Ranger stared at him, the dog's amber eyes unblinking, as if he saw through the man's skin into the guilt underneath. Next to Dylan sat his attorney, Victor Hale, a tall, lean man in his mid-50s with a jaw like a hatchet and a reputation for defending corporate offenders. His salt-and-pepper hair was parted with military precision, and a thin scar ran across his chin, a souvenir from a bar fight in his youth that had hardened him rather than humbled him. Hale had a sharp tongue, a colder heart, and a talent for intimidating juries with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his own superiority. Ethan took his seat beside the public defender assigned to him, a young woman named Amy Lockwood, slender and soft-spoken with sandy hair tied in a low bun and round glasses perched at the tip of her nose. She looked barely older than her law school photo. Her voice trembled each time she addressed Ethan, but her determination shone through her nerves. She had taken his case at the last minute, insisting that everyone deserves someone who believes them, at least once. Judge Reynolds entered, the kind of man the robe seemed made for. In his early 60s, tall with a square jaw, close-cropped silver hair, and a permanent crease between his brows. He had the demeanor of someone who had seen every sort of lie unfold in his courtroom and no longer bothered pretending to be surprised by any of them. "Bring in the witness," he ordered. The doors opened, and Grace Monroe entered with careful steps, escorted by an officer. Her left temple bore a healing bruise, and though she wore a fitted charcoal blazer, her posture was slightly off, favoring her right side. The overhead lights reflected off her chestnut hair, tied loosely behind her shoulders. Despite the injury, her expression carried the sharpness of a woman accustomed to command. She did not look at Ethan. She didn't yet know the man who saved her was the same one now on trial for evading parole and allegedly stealing government equipment. Grace approached the stand, took the oath, and sat. As the prosecutor questioned her about the accident, her composure held, until a sudden pain seized behind her eyes. She pressed a hand to her forehead, breath trembling. The courtroom blurred around her. Ranger reacted first. The German shepherd shot to his feet, pulling the lead from Ethan's hand in one smooth motion. Before anyone could react, he bounded up the aisle toward Grace, leaping onto the step below the witness stand. He pressed his body firmly against her leg, applying steady pressure exactly the way he had in the storm. The courtroom erupted in gasps and shouts. "Get that dog back!" the bailiff barked. But Grace's hand suddenly stilled. Her breathing steadied, her pupils refocused. And then, recognition. Pure, visceral recognition. She looked down at Ranger, watched the dog's trained posture, the gentle insistence of his weight, the same gesture that had kept her conscious inside the frozen wreckage. Her gaze snapped to Ethan. He stood halfway up from his seat, prepared to pull Ranger away, but frozen by the shock on her face. Grace swallowed hard. "It was you," she whispered, barely audible. "You're the one who pulled me from the cliff." A murmur rippled across the courtroom. Judge Reynolds struck his gavel. "Order! Order!" Grace straightened, the pain subsiding as Ranger released the pressure. "Your Honor," she said, voice steadier now, "before we proceed, I need to present information directly relevant to Mr. Cole's charges." Dylan tensed, gripping the edge of the table. Grace continued, "My vehicle did not go off the road by accident. I was forced off. I was investigating a financial diversion scheme linked to Hartman Logistics." Gasps spread. Victor Hale stood abruptly. "Objection! Speculation!" "I have evidence," Grace interrupted. She held up a folder, its contents sealed in a clear pouch retrieved from her damaged vehicle that morning. "And among that evidence is GPS metadata from the company's truck roster." Her eyes locked on the judge. "The truck Mr. Hartman claims Mr. Cole used to steal equipment never left the loading bay that night. Its engine temperature readings and tire pressure logs show zero movement between 6 p.m. and midnight. Meaning," she turned, her gaze, sharp as glass, toward Dylan. "Mr. Cole was framed." The courtroom erupted again. the judge hammered the gavel. Silence! Before anything else could be said, the back doors opened with a commanding slam. A man stepped inside. Officer Liam Parker, Alaska State Trooper. He wore a dark tactical jacket dusted with melting snow, the badge clipped at his chest, glinting under the lights. Liam was in his late 30s, tall, muscular, with close-cropped black hair and a rugged jaw lined with 2 days of stubble. His brown eyes carried the steady, practiced calm of someone who had seen combat and survived it. Years of service had honed him into a man of discipline, though shadows of old battles clung faintly behind his expression. He had been Ethan's teammate once, another SEAL forged by fire. Liam approached the judge, voice low but clear. Your Honor, Agent Monroe's investigation aligns with an active probe by the State Bureau. Dylan Hartman is under suspicion for federal and state fraud. We're ready to take him into custody. Dylan's face drained of color. Victor Hale sputtered, "This is outrageous." But Ranger growled, a deep, primal warning that silenced everyone. Judge Reynolds leaned back, eyes narrowed. Then this court will pause proceedings to address these developments. Ethan felt the weight on his chest loosen for the first time in months, but the moment of victory cracked as suddenly as it formed. Liam's radio crackled sharply. A dispatcher's voice broke through, urgent and strained. Unit 4 to Parker. Be advised we have a breach at the courthouse loading dock. Unknown subject armed. Repeat, armed. Liam pivoted toward the exit. Grace lifted her head, fear flickering. They found me. Ethan locked eyes with Ranger. The dog's body stiffened, hackles rising, and the courtroom doors at the side corridor began to open, slowly, deliberately. The chapter ends here, hanging on the brink of danger. Winter on Kodiak never surrendered quickly. It loosened its grip the way an old soldier released a weapon, slowly, cautiously, as if the cold still had one more battle to fight. But by late April, the island began to soften. Snow retreated into patches beneath spruce trees, the ocean turned a gentler shade of steel blue, and sunlight stretched its fingers over the land in long, warm strokes. It was the kind of season that made even men hardened by war believe in second chances. Ethan Cole hammered the final plank into place on the small deck outside his cabin. Sawdust clung to his forearms, catching on the coarse, dark hair along his skin. He had trimmed his beard for the first time in months, leaving a short, neat scruff that defined the hard cut of his jaw. The tension that once lived permanently in his shoulders had eased, replaced with something cautiously hopeful. The court had cleared his name, his parole lifted, Dylan arrested, and the investigation now pointed toward a larger criminal web Ethan had unknowingly stepped into. Ranger lay in a patch of sunlight a few feet away, tail flicking lazily. His winter coat had started to shed, revealing sleeker fur beneath. The dog looked younger somehow, as if the danger of the past months had aged him briefly, and the warmth of spring reversed it again. His good ear stayed perked, always listening, while the folded ears twitched from instinct more than function. Ethan set down the hammer and stretched, gazing out toward the tree line. Birds had returned. The world felt alive again, and yet, he sensed something coming. Ranger must have felt it too, because his head suddenly lifted, gaze fixed on the gravel road leading up to the cabin. A silver SUV appeared between the trees. Grace Monroe stepped out, her boots crunching lightly against the gravel. She wore a soft green sweater under a light jacket, her chestnut hair loose and catching the light in warm copper strands. The bruise on her temple had faded to a faint shadow, but a small scar remained, delicate and pale, a reminder of the night she nearly died. She carried herself differently now. The tension of her investigation weeks earlier had eased. Today, she was not the federal prosecutor whose words could break a criminal empire. She was simply a woman standing before the man who had saved her life. "Ethan," she said, smiling with a brightness he wasn't used to seeing on her. "Your home looks peaceful." "It's getting there," he answered, rubbing the back of his neck, a habit that surfaced only when he was unsure how to express himself. "Didn't expect to see you this far out. Government office is a long ways from here." She stepped closer. "I'm not here on business." Ranger trotted over to greet her, nudging her hand with his nose. She laughed softly, kneeling to scratch behind his ear. "Hello again, hero." Ethan watched the scene, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He owed Ranger everything, but he had never imagined the dog would play matchmaker in a life he thought too broken for anything resembling closeness. Grace rose, her expression gentling. "I wanted to thank you properly, not just for saving my life, but for trusting me in that courtroom. I know how hard that was." "Trust doesn't come easy," Ethan admitted. "Not for me, not anymore." "And yet," she said, stepping near enough for him to feel the warmth of her breath, "you still jumped off a cliff for a stranger." He chuckled softly. "Well, old habits. SEAL training sticks." A rustling sound came from the trees. Ranger stiffened again, but his posture relaxed when he recognized the approaching figure. Liam Parker emerged from the woods, still in uniform pants but wearing a dark fleece jacket instead of tactical gear. His presence carried the solidity of a man who had spent half his life in service, shoulders squared, posture balanced, expression sober but not unkind. His black hair was wind-tossed, shorter on the sides, and his stubble had grown into a heavier shadow across his jaw. He walked with purpose but not danger. "Thought I might find you here," Liam said, nodding to Ethan. "The trail looked too quiet. Figured you were building something." "Just trying to make the place livable," Ethan replied. "Thought you'd be in Anchorage." Liam shook his head. "Not today. Wanted to bring you some news. And a warning." Grace glanced between the two men. "About Dylan?" "About who Dylan was working for." Liam's tone darkened. "The fraud case you stumbled into wasn't just a side hustle. It's part of a bigger laundering network operating through maritime shipping routes. Dylan was a pawn, a loud one, a stupid one, but not the one pulling the strings." Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling reality settle like a weight across his shoulders. "So, this isn't over." "No," Liam said. "But you're not their target anymore. Grace's testimony, the data from her investigation, and your military record made the Bureau shift focus." He looked at Grace. "They'll come after people higher up the chain, but both of you should stay alert." Grace nodded, absorbing the information. Liam stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You did good, brother. I'm proud of you. Not many men would have done what you did." Ethan swallowed the knot rising in his throat. Praise from Liam, his former teammate, a man who had dragged him out of firefights and stood beside him in darker moments than he cared to remember, meant more than he could put into words. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. Liam gave a short nod, then crouched to ruffle Ranger's fur. "And you, still the best damn dog in any unit." Ranger's tail thumped proudly. After Liam left, the air felt still, warm, intimate. Grace stepped beside Ethan on the deck. He's right, you know. You do good, even when it costs you. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then at the mountains touched with spring light. I spent years trying to disappear, he said softly. Didn't think there was anything left worth holding on to. Grace moved closer, close enough that her shoulder brushed his. Maybe there is now. Ranger padded between them and curled at their feet, placing his head across both their boots, his silent, symbolic claim of unity. The same gesture he'd made in the storm, binding two strangers together through survival. Ethan reached down, resting a hand on Ranger's back, then another atop Grace's hand as she joined him. None of them spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was safe, warm, whole. The sun dipped lower, casting gold across Kodiak Island. Winter had not surrendered easily, but spring had arrived all the same. And for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt something bloom inside him. The fragile, unfamiliar promise of a future he might want to stay for. A seal, a prosecutor, and a shepherd, three souls fractured by different storms, had found each other on a rugged island at the edge of the world. Here, where the seasons turned slowly, hope returned too.